Hi everybody, Jake Drake Teacher's Pet. Chapter 3 is called Special Treatment. When I got home that afternoon, I walked right up to my room. I didn't even get a snack. That's how come my mom followed me. She came into my room and said, "Jake, is everything all right?" I didn't know how to explain, because if I said to her, all of my teachers and even my principal all think I'm wonderful, then my mom would say something like, "Well, you are wonderful, Jake, because that's what moms do." So I said, "I'm okay, Mom. I just got kind of tired at school today." Which was true. Having every kid in the school think you're trying to be the teacher's pet makes you tired, and being whomped 6 or 7 times by a dodgeball doesn't help either. But after dinner, we got to watch this really good TV show about the Coast Guard, and so I stopped thinking about school, and I felt better. After Dad read a chapter of our book at bedtime, and after he tucked me in and kissed me goodnight and turned out my light, I couldn't help thinking about school again. The way I finally got to sleep was by telling myself it was probably just a bad Monday. I told myself that tomorrow, everything would go back to normal. Tomorrow, I would just be a regular kid again. That's what I told myself, and I hoped it would be true. I wanted it to be true. I needed it to be true. And I went to sleep believing it. Tuesday's bus ride to school was great. I was just a kid, not too loud, not too quiet. The bus driver didn't even notice I was there, and no one said a word about anything that had happened on Monday. And I said to myself, "See? Nothing to worry about." But I spoke too soon. The second I walked into her room, Mrs. Snaven said, "Oh good, you're here, Jake. I don't know how I'll ever survive another day without my special computer helper." Then she pointed at her computer screen and said, "I've got that math program open, and I'm afraid it's all muddled again. Would you come over here and see if I've done this right?" She hadn't done it right, so I had to fix it for her. And when I got done, Mrs. Snaven said, "Jake, you've saved my life again." By that time, almost all the other kids were in the classroom. I could feel them looking at me, and I could tell they were thinking, "There's the teacher's pet, already hard at work." And it really looked that way. Because who did Mrs. Snaven pick to take the attendance sheet down to the office? Me. And during reading period, who did Mrs. Snaven call in first to read out loud? Me. And who did Mrs. Snaven choose to be first in line to go to assembly in the auditorium? Me. Everyone had been looking forward to that assembly for a while. It was this lady who called herself Miss Thumbelina the storyteller. She had performed at our school before, and she was great. She told stories, but she didn't just read them. She acted out all the parts all by herself. She had a bunch of different costumes and hats and beards and wigs and huge baskets full of things like swords and ropes and lanterns. If there was a castle in a story, then she'd pull a chunk of a castle wall out of a basket and make you believe the whole castle was right there. I was glad Miss Thumbelina was performing that Tuesday. It was only 10:30, but already I needed a break. I wanted to sit in a huge room in the middle of all the kids from grades 3, 4, and 5. Then the auditorium would get dark, and I could disappear into the crowd and enjoy the show. Miss Thumbelina came onto the stage, and we all started clapping. She had on this wig with long red hair. She made a low bow, and then she said, "Good morning. I'm going to start our program with an old story. To help me tell this story, I need a helper. Someone who's loyal and true and honest and good, a real knight in shining armor." And then she held one hand up to her forehead to shade her eyes from the bright lights, and with her other hand, she pointed out into the audience. And she pointed at a 4th grader sitting right in front of me. "You there," she said. "You look like a prince to me. Come up on stage and help me tell this tale." The kid started to shake his head no, and I felt sorry for him. Suddenly, Mrs. Snaven was there next to me. She said, "Jake, you're the perfect one to help her." And she said it way too loud. She grabbed me up by the arm and pulled me out of my seat. When Miss Thumbelina saw me standing up, she clapped her hands and said, "Great! Here comes our prince!" 15 seconds later, I was walking across the stage, blinking like crazy and trying not to trip on the stuff that was everywhere. There's no way to get ready for the worst 10 minutes of your life. One minute, I was sitting in the dark, enjoying the show, and the next minute, I was the show. And this lady in a big wig was sticking a knight's helmet on my head and strapping plastic armor around my chest. Then she handed me a long sword, which would have been fun to mess with if for 400 kids hadn't been laughing at me. Then Miss Thumbelina put this thing around me that was supposed to be a horse. There was a horse's head in front and a horse's rump and tail and back, and there was a place for me in the middle. The whole thing hung from my shoulders by 2 straps. To make the horse go, I had to run like this. Ba-dum, 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 ba-dum. She hooked me into the horse. She said, "Now, here's all you have to do. Wait behind the curtains, and whenever I say, 'Someone will save me,' you come galloping all the way across the stage, right past me, and you wave your sword and yell, 'I'll save you, princess!' Then you go behind the curtains on the far side and wait there. And then when I say that line again, you run out and do the same thing, okay?" I nodded and said okay, because I was already strapped into the costume and the lady was ready to start. What else could I do? I hid behind the curtains and Miss Thumbelina started telling her story. The way the story went, she said, "Someone will save me," about 20 times. Then this dopey knight would gallop across the stage yelling, "I'll save you, princess." That was the big joke. That was me. I was the big dopey joke. Finally, the story was over. Miss Thumbelina made me and my horse come to the center of the stage. I had to hold her hand and take a bow. Then I galloped over behind the curtain and I got out of that costume in about 3 seconds. I think I set a new record for blushing that day. Even though there was a show up on the stage, every time I looked around, it felt like half the kids in the auditorium were looking at me. So I tried not to notice. And it worked, because after a while, I forgot about my terrible time on the stage, and I just watched the rest of the stories like everyone else. At the end of the last story, everybody clapped like crazy. It really was a great assembly, and the teacher stood up, and Mrs. Carp walked onto the stage. She held up her hands, and the clapping stopped. Mrs. Carp said, "I know I speak for everyone when I tell Miss Thumbelina how much we all enjoyed her performance today. Let's all give her one last round of applause." So we all started clapping and cheering again. Then Mrs. Carp held up her hand again, and the noise stopped, just like turning off a TV. Mrs. Carp said, "And before I forget, Jake, would you come back up on stage?" The whole auditorium got quiet except for some scattered giggling. I turned bright red and walked up onto the stage. Mrs. Carp motioned for me to come and stand beside her. Then she said, "I think we should also give a nice round of applause to our young man of many talents, our own Jake Drake." And as she said my name, she reached down and patted me on the head. I'm not sure who started it, but I think it was Ben Grumson, because when the kids started clapping, someone began saying, "Jake Drake, Jake Drake, Jake Drake," and every kid in the room picked up on it. 400 kids started chanting my name. Then, the strangest thing I've ever seen happened. Instead of frowning and stopping the chanting like she could have, Mrs. Carp smiled and started clapping her hands, and she chanted along with the kids, "Jake Drake, Jake Drake, Jake Drake." I couldn't believe it. I felt like I was in a movie where aliens had taken over a school and made everyone act completely nuts. And all the kids and teachers and Mrs. Carp had chanted my name about 15 times. It was starting to feel like the roof might blow off the auditorium. Finally, Mrs. Carp held up her hand, and right away the noise stopped, because even in the middle of a riot, no one would ever mess around with Mrs. Carp. And then the principal dismissed us to go back to our classrooms and get ready for lunch, like nothing strange had happened at all. So I tried to act that way too. I kept my eyes on the floor and went back to our classroom. And when some kid in the hallway started chanting, "Jake Drake, Jake Drake, Jake Drake," I didn't look up. I just kept walking. I was so glad to be back in my own classroom. It was going to be so good to go to lunch and sit down in a quiet corner with Willie. I opened my desk to get my lunch, and I gasped. A bunch of kids turned to look at me. I must have sounded like I'd seen a ghost, except it was scarier than that, because I had forgotten. There, under my lunch bag, was the most horrible thing I'd ever seen. That bright orange patrol belt. I was not going to have a quiet lunch with my best friend. For the second time in 1 hour, I was going to put on a costume and get on a stage. This time, I wasn't going to be a knight in shining armor. This time, I had to put on a floppy orange belt and walk into the cafeteria, because every kid in grades 3, 4, and 5 was waiting for me. Everyone was waiting for Garbage Guy.